So for more on the 2020 election, we want to bring in Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. I think we're going to start with these Supreme Court rulings on extending the period for receiving mail-in ballots in two crucial battleground states, Pennsylvania and North Carolina. These suits were brought by the Republican parties, but I want to ask you, are those rulings, are they potential victories for Mr. Biden's reelection efforts, or Mr. Biden's election efforts, or a detriment?
They're potential victories, but they're not secure and settled. I was encouraged that Judge Barrett declined to participate in them, but she should have recused herself, given the ways in which President Trump pointedly and publicly urged her being rushed onto the court so she could help him win the election by, as he put it, helping count the ballots. Several justices said that this is not a settled issue. They declined to rule on it right now, just before the election. But in Pennsylvania, those ballots that are received after Election Day, but before the end of the period for mail-in ballots to be received, are going to be set aside, and this issue may be relitigated in front of the Supreme Court just after the election.
Senator, just to follow up on that, it's Vlad Duthiers. I'm curious, why do you think that the president and the Republicans are looking for a pretext to throw out votes as we approach this election?
Well, sadly, as we've seen over several election cycles, Republicans have sharpened their tools for voter suppression, for making it harder for people to get to the polls, to vote in a timely and safe way. During the primaries over the last 6 months in the United States, as this pandemic was raging, we saw state after state struggle with very long lines, struggle with not having enough polling places open safely and securely. As one of the senators who fought for more funding to help state and local election officials deliver a safe voting experience this election, I was deeply frustrated that Republicans at the federal level didn't join with us in providing robust funding. Doing an election safely in states where they are not used to voting either during a pandemic or by mail requires robust investment. And frankly, I think this ought to be bipartisan, a commitment to a free and fair and safe election. And I'm gravely concerned that it's not.
Let me ask you, Senator, about an issue that I don't think many people had been talking about until maybe most recently, this issue of expanding the Supreme Court. Joe Biden was asked a number of times about his position. Finally, on 60 Minutes, he said that, if he's elected, he would create a bipartisan commission to look into expanding the court. You have said that it's something that you would be willing to sort of look into as well. We know that now we have Judge Barrett on the Supreme Court. Do you think that Biden's approach, the issue of putting together a commission, do you think that this is the right approach?
Anne-Marie, I think this is a balanced approach for how best to move forward with addressing the ways in which the federal courts have become unbalanced in the last 4 years. Republicans, I'll remind you, 4 years ago spent 10 months saying, oh, we couldn't possibly seat a Supreme Court justice during an election year, and so refused to give a hearing or a vote to a highly qualified centrist judge nominated by President Obama after Justice Scalia died. Now, 4 years later, when Justice Ginsburg died, they raced through a nominee, a highly partisan nominee, in just a few weeks before an election. Never in American history has a Supreme Court nominee been confirmed 8 days before a presidential election when a majority of states were already voting. But it's not just these justices that have been put on the Supreme Court. It's dozens and dozens of circuit court and district court judges who were deemed unqualified to serve by the American Bar Association or who had disturbing extremist views. I frankly think it's time for us to take a step back and have a bipartisan commission, as Joe Biden is suggesting, to look hard at how we preserve the independence of our courts and rebalance them.
Senator, let me switch gears here and ask you, if Vice President Biden is successful and is elected president of the United States, let's talk about some of the things that he could do right away. CBS News has learned that Mr. Biden is pledging that if he wins the White House, he'd sign an executive order on day one forming a task force to reunite hundreds of immigrant children separated from their families. Yes. Are task force the best way of addressing this issue, executive orders, or do some members of your party see this as perhaps not being aggressive enough?
Well, there's nothing more aggressive, as you put it, than he can do to respond to the inhumane mistreatment of children who were brought to this country by their parents fleeing violence and oppression in other countries, than to say through an executive order immediately to a number of federal agencies, let's get this done as quickly as we possibly can. The forceful separation of parents and children at the border in order to terrorize them and deter people from trying to come to this country was one of the most immoral chapters in President Trump's 4 years so far as president. And I do think a President Biden, if elected next Tuesday, will take prompt action. I also think he'll promptly revisit the issue of the Muslim travel ban, something that President Trump ran on and implemented promptly after being elected, something that I think is a moral stain on our immigration policies, that we continue to divide American families who happen to have relatives or ancestry in Muslim-majority countries. There's other things that I expect he would do promptly as well. Joe Biden's been committed to rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement and to restoring our leadership on the world stage. When Donald Trump talks about climate, the only word he can come up with is hoax. When Joe Biden talks about climate, the first word that comes to his mind is jobs. He will make sure that we continue to have high-quality manufacturing and extraction jobs in industries like fracking in Pennsylvania, but he will stop new or expanded fracking on public lands out west. And he's got a plan that I support fully for how we will create new high-quality jobs as we transition to a cleaner economy over the next 25 years.
Senator, let me ask you about something that is probably top of mind for many Americans. How are they going to survive through this pandemic? House Speaker Nancy Pelosi sent a letter to Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin asking for answers to issues that she says are unresolved when it comes to the COVID relief negotiations. She wants to know about, funding for testing and tracing, state and local funding, schools. The Senate is not in session, will not be back in session until November 9th. What do you say to these Americans who are having trouble paying their bills, who are worried if their businesses will stay afloat, who see that we are either in the midst of an extended first wave of this pandemic or in the midst of a second wave? What do you say to them when all they need to do is survive from day to day?
Anne-Marie, this is part of why I was so frustrated, even angry, in the last 3 weeks as the Senate was in session only to consider a nominee to the Supreme Court, not to take up and negotiate a real bipartisan package that would have delivered relief to 6 million Americans who are behind on their rent or their mortgage and are concerned about being evicted, 25 million Americans who are unemployed, and millions of small businesses and nonprofits that have had to shut down. We could have delivered timely relief to all of these people and more if the Senate had simply taken up, amended, debated, and sent back to the House the bill that the House passed 4 months ago. It was enormously frustrating that Speaker Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin were negotiating, but Majority Leader McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, was nowhere to be found in these negotiations. He's spent this entire year focused on putting conservative judges on courts, not focused on delivering meaningful relief to the American people. We did show 6 months ago, unanimously, the Senate did pass the CARES Act, which was an important first round of relief. But for the rest of these last 6 months, there's been no positive forward progress by the Republican majority in the Senate. And ultimately, those negotiations you were just talking about, Anne-Marie, between the Speaker of the House and the Treasury Secretary broke down when the Republican majority in the Senate refused to participate and support more relief. We need that now. That's what I hear from Delawareans every day. Why didn't you get that done? When we get back into session on November 9th, it should be our first order of business.
Senator, I think most people can understand that you need to sort of take a holistic approach when it comes to offering support. But why not just, a mini bill? Why not just a little bit of money to help people, get through maybe to the end of the year, get through the holiday season? Wouldn't that have been easier to pass and would have at least helped many, many people?
Right. So if we had seen a bill that accomplished that goal, that provided relief for not just small businesses, but also unemployed individuals, also families, also renters and mortgage holders, those who are facing eviction, the Senate would have taken up and passed it. Instead, what we got the opportunity to talk about was a skinny, narrow bill that only touched on a few areas and that included a poison pill designed to say to Democrats, if you're going to support this, we're going to give a get-out-of-jail-free card for every employer in the country to relieve them of any liability, no matter whether they were responsible or reckless with their workforce and their customers and consumers. That was something Mitch McConnell knew from 6 months ago no Democrat was going to vote for. When that's what he talked about putting on the floor, he had neither Republican support for that spending nor Democratic support for that liability relief. Look, Mitch McConnell knows how to get a package done. If he wants to get real relief out to the American people, even smaller than what the House proposed, but what the Senate could pass, he knows how to do that, and that's not what he did in the last 3 weeks.
Senator, let me ask you, speaking of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, this circles back to the top of our discussion with regards to Vice President Biden's plan for what he calls judicial reform. This term, court packing, has been lobbed about quite often in the last couple of weeks, last couple of months. But just some statistics to share, which I'm sure you probably know, but maybe our viewers don't. Because of the Republican obstruction under President Obama, there were 103 judicial vacancies that were available when President Trump was elected to office, and that's from a 2020 Brookings study. As of October 6, 218 judges have been confirmed. That is more than President Trump's Republican predecessors, and only second to, I think, Jimmy Carter. So the average age of Trump-appointed judges is about 48 years old. So this term court packing, I mean, how do you react to those numbers when you hear your colleagues on the other side saying that a Biden potential presidency would mean packing the court, when you look at all the number of judges that Mitch McConnell and other Republicans have been able to get onto the bench?
Well, I've lived this week after week over the last 4 years. That's exactly right. It was Republican obstruction that held open more than 100 federal judgeships by the end of the term of President Obama. He was denied the opportunity to fill seats on the district courts, circuit courts, and the Supreme Court by Republican obstructionism. And then the Federalist Society and the Trump White House moved into high gear and jammed through more conservative, young, and in more than a dozen cases, demonstrably unqualified federal judges than any administration in history. That's why I use the phrase rebalancing the courts, because I think we need to look hard at how this partisan confirmation process and the obstructionism of the last 4 years under Obama by Republicans led to federal courts that are now filled with young, out of the mainstream conservative judges who will be on these courts for a generation and move our national life in terms of the rights and liberties that Americans have come to expect far to the right. A large part of why I voted against Judge Barrett was I'm convinced that she will be a conservative judicial activist in the model of Justice Thomas, farther to the right than even Justice Scalia, and go back and revisit and possibly overturn long-settled cases that protect issues that are of top of mind for Americans, like health care and privacy and reproductive rights, yes, but also areas like labor rights, consumer protection, environmental protection, criminal defense rights. All of these are at risk now, and I don't think your average American yet fully grasps the scope of the consequences of just how conservative the entire federal judiciary has now become after 4 years of activism by President Trump.
All right, Senator Coons, thank you very, very much. Before we let you go, Senator, if Vice President Biden is victorious and becomes President Biden and he offers you a cabinet spot, what would you want to do?
I'd want to reflect on how I can best serve the people of Delaware and see what that opportunity is. President Biden, if elected, will be blessed to have around him an entire circle of people who he's known and worked with for many years. He has great experience in foreign policy and has some very talented advisors among whom he could choose. So my expectation is I will likely be still in the Senate helping to deliver bipartisan solutions. But if asked to serve, I would seriously consider it.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much, Senator Coons. We appreciate it as always.
Thank you.